Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on social media. Today, I am turning the podcast over to my friend and colleague, Nancy Marie Spears, who is the Indigenous Children and Families reporter for the Imprint. Now, just before the new year, the Protect ICWA Campaign, ICWA stands for Indian Child Welfare Act, released ICWA 2050, which is a 25-year strategy to strengthen the Indian Child Welfare Act and tribal child welfare overall. Spears put together a roundtable of experts to discuss the campaign, its goals, and much more about one of America's most significant child welfare and Indigenous rights laws. So without further ado, here is that conversation hosted by Nancy Marie Spears. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm Nancy Marie Spears, the Indigenous Children and Families reporter for the Imprint. Today we're talking about something that sort of rolled out around election time last November regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, and how compliance with the federal law and its affiliated state statutes can be improved over the next 25 years. This plan by the Protect ICWA Campaign is called the ICWA 2050 Plan. The National Indian Child Welfare Association and its partners aim to accomplish a number of things to strengthen Indigenous child welfare policy and practices around the United States. For those out there listening that haven't heard of the plan, at the center of today's roundtable discussion, I'll give you a quick overview. ICWA 2050 was launched on November 7th by the Protect ICWA Campaign to honor ICWA's 46th anniversary, and it's called Protect, Preserve, Progress, Realizing the Spirit of the Indian Child Welfare Act. There are 4 key goals: increase tribal child welfare capacity, improve outcomes in state child welfare systems, enhance tribal-federal partnerships, and improve communication about ICWA as the quote-unquote gold standard of child welfare policy. I'm excited to share with our national audience all the ways that our guests on today's show will be engaging with this 25-year plan, which, according to the National Congress of American Indians Executive Director Larry Wright Jr., quote, not only fortifies protections for Native children today, but also builds a path for generations to come, ensuring that our children remain grounded in their cultures and communities, end quote. We have with us today our panelists. Sarah Kastelic is Alaska Native and serves as the Executive Director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. Tiana Loper is Chickasaw and serves as the Executive Director at the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association. Kimberly Clough is the Legal Director at the California Tribal Families Coalition. And Linda S. Spears is the President and CEO of the Child Welfare League of America. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here.
Good morning.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's a delight to be here.
So we've got a lot to get to. Sarah, I'm going to kick it off with you because I know we've talked at length in the past about what NICWA and the Protect ICWA campaign envisions for this work. I know this is obviously a long-term plan, but I imagine you have ideas of which parts of the plan to tackle in the early stages. Which goal outlined in the plan do you feel is most immediately actionable and why?
Well, thanks so much for having us, Nancy. It's a real treat to get to be here with these wonderful colleagues and talk with you about the work that we have before us. When I think about what's most immediately actionable, I have to say it's exciting that at the end of last year, we took significant steps towards some goals in the plan. The first goal is support for tribes and tribal capacity. At the end of last year, Congress passed H.R. 9076, Supporting America's Children and Families Act. In that act, there was an increase for funding in Title 4B, Subparts 1 and 2, and a change to the formula that actually sets aside more resources for tribal child welfare programs. That same bill also doubled funding for the Tribal Court Improvement Project. Just some really big wins there. And then very quickly, I would say that same piece of legislation also impacted Goal 3 of our plan, the tribal-federal relationship that you mentioned, and a goal around a compliance measurement system for ICWA. So really looking at how ICWA compliance is occurring or not across the country, collecting data related to AFGARs, the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis Reporting System, looking at state ICWA cases and developing a robust system to measure state implementation and compliance with ICWA. Those are really huge goals that we've had since the passage of the Act 46 years ago. And we're starting to make some real progress on that. So that's super exciting.
Yeah, and that funding piece is extremely crucial to all of the things that we're talking about regarding ICWA. So I appreciate you speaking to that. Following up on that, Sarah, another key component of this plan is increasing capacity for tribal child welfare systems. I was wondering if you could describe for listeners at home who may not know, what are the key limitations to tribal child welfare systems capacity, and what are some specific ways that capacity can be increased on the ground?
Well, tribes face some of the same challenges as state systems, and they also face some unique challenges. First, I would just say that in terms of the workforce, we hear everywhere we go in Indian country that tribes, like states, are really challenged by turnover in these really difficult jobs child welfare workers have. And so there's a real need for workforce training. And in many places, there are also sustained vacancies. So it's hard to recruit people into these jobs, particularly as there's a generational shift in the workforce and more baby boomers are retiring. Many tribal communities are looking for the next generation of people who are passionate about kids and families who are going to take on this work. So I think that workforce issue is really central and has big implications for workforce training, which is something that many of us here in this conversation today do. It'll be good to hear more about the roles each of us play in that regard. But the other thing I would say is that often we see that tribal systems aren't taking full advantage of the authority they have to design their programs in a way that's reflective of their cultures and traditions. And so, no surprise, when tribal authority to develop tribal child welfare programs was recognized, many tribes developed systems that mirrored the programs that were around them. Those were seen as the quote unquote legitimate systems. So the funders who are funding those systems and partners who are partnering with those systems had a particular model of child welfare in mind. And so when tribes received a little bit of resources and were able to develop those programs in the early 80s, what we saw was that tribes were developing systems that looked very similar to state systems, which were systems that perpetuated so much harm for our people. And so something that really gives me a lot of heart and hope about the work happening now is tribes around the country are really redesigning those systems. They're reclaiming their ability to found those systems on their worldview, culture, values, naming things in their native languages that reflect the philosophy and goal of those programs. And so I think while there's certainly some challenges around funding, around workforce in tribal child welfare, we are really seeing tribes do some amazing things. And I would just quickly say our 43rd annual Protecting Our Children conference is coming up March 30th through April 2nd in Orlando, Florida. And if you really want to see what tribes across the country are doing, it will be on full display at that conference. So I hope you and our listeners can be there to learn more about that.
Yeah, lots of exciting work going on in tribal child welfare. Thank you, Sarah. Kimberly, I want to pivot to you. Since you work with so many tribes in legislative policy and the legal realm, what can be done from your vantage point to improve tribal child welfare capacity? What are the primary capacity problems you're seeing in California, and how do you think that they can be addressed through the California Tribal Family Coalition's engagement with this ICWA 2050 plan?
I want to start with saying thank you, Nancy, for allowing me to have space with these experts and for continuing the conversation just over time, which is very necessary. I also want to say, just from a language perspective, one thing that we're really focused on at CTFC, California Tribal Families Coalition, is to move away from the concept of ICWA compliance. Compliance isn't adequate. So how do we build tribal child welfare capacity? We want to think about thrivance, the promise and potential of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Compliance, the bottom, and that's not enough. And as Sarah so beautifully stated, tribes are seeing that they can do better than mimic what is next door, what's in their county or their state. At CTFC, in thinking about what does it look like for tribes to achieve, and their partners at counties or states, achieve the promise of the Indian Child Welfare Act? One thing that is critical is cyclical funding. it simply cannot continue to be cyclical funding, where the rules around a pot of resources change year to year, cycle to cycle. We've moved away from tribes looking to grants and philanthropy as a sole source. You may hire a wonderful tribal social worker eager to work for her village or tribe. Then 2 years later, that grant disappears and the tribe can't continue to have that person. And so it's actually been quite detrimental in the past, these cyclical funding sources. So I think that's one area that's been a real problem. I think the other is that we see, especially in some areas in Alaska or California, some tribal communities are very small. When a resource requires a tribe, in order just to apply, to build some really giant infrastructure or have the ability to create giant reports or produce data, tribes will not step into that, or they do and it doesn't work well. So I think the other area is to figure out ways in which tribes can not be required to have this bureaucratic view of, if you want to get these resources, you've got to do all these things. And there are lots of tangible ways we can do that. Coalitions between tribes coming together and pooling resources, for example, as long as doing so at the tribe's discretion and isn't undermining tribal sovereignty. So I think that if we put our heads together, it can be accomplished, that we overcome these capacity problems that we see. And there are others, and I'm sure the other folks on will also raise some of those as well.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Yeah, a lot of really important implications around the need for collaboration between tribes and states and collaboration between tribes and the federal government, but really kind of more of how can we get the conversation really bolstered around getting state child welfare systems to see the spirit of ICWA and fulfill the promise of what this law is intended to do. So, Linda, I'll turn to you. My first question for you. You are this Indigenous person who now leads an organization, the Child Welfare League of America, that has historically been part of the federal Indian boarding schools policies through its involvement with the Indian Adoption Project between 1958 and 1967. And I can imagine, as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous woman, that can be a really interesting thing for you to be thinking about in your current role. With that legacy in mind, can you describe any specific examples around how the Child Welfare League of America intends to engage with the ICWA 2050 plan?
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you today. My name is Linda Spears, as Nancy's already indicated. I am the daughter of Donald and Gloria, who are just amazing parents. My mom was a social worker. My dad was an engineer. It introduces and influences everything about how I think of the world and see the world. I grew up and continue to be a member of the Narragansett Indian tribe in Rhode Island. So my tribal roots are back home in Rhode Island and try to get there as often as I can. My family is still there, and certainly both immediate and extended family are still there. I think there are lots of ways that we will be engaged in the 2050 plan. I worked at Child Welfare League of America before this current stint as CEO. And it was probably in 1999, 2000-ish, that I sat on the floor of the Child Welfare League of America. And I knew there was history with the Indian Adoption Project. I sat on the floor looking at one of our boxes from the archives, reading project reports from the Indian Adoption Project. And as I did so, aside from, how do you sit in the office in tears as you read what white social workers at the time thought they were doing versus what they were really doing, right? They thought they were saving our kids. And they were not. Obviously, they separated children, the harm from that experience, visits on tribes and children and families every single day to this day, and will continue for generations forward. At the time, it became for me the reason I was at the organization. And that was part of the notion that we had to write our course as an organization and to really reflect that work. We had partnered with NICWA for many years and had talked about this with prior members of the leadership at NICWA, Terry Cross, and the board and staff at the organization. And I think at that time, we committed that we would continue to work on issues of Indian children in America and the tribes that provide for their future and their sustenance each and every day. And really worked hard to do that. I look at the ICWA 2050 plan and approach, and first off, I'm extraordinarily excited by that work. I think it's extraordinary, visionary, and yet at the same time, grounded in the roots and the history of the people who were around that table on the first days to say we must do this and we must plan differently for our kids and we must have some federal policy that ensures that happens. We have a lot of places where we can work together. One is the issue of the competence and clarity and performance of state child welfare agencies, many of whom are members of Child Welfare League of America. We've worked with NICWA, with ICWA state managers for a number of years to support them, help them to collaborate with each other and understand what best practices are. In that process, we've learned a lot and I think have done a lot of work to say, how do states advance state tribe agreements? How do they advance policies at the state level that support tribal recognition? In Massachusetts, back in the day, I worked in Massachusetts growing up as a manager in child welfare. And we had state recognized tribes, as a number of states do, not all of them, but some. But it became really important for us to say, as a state recognized tribe, with a tribe that was at the table when ICWA was first conceived and passed, that we, the Wampanoag tribe, that we actually work together to say what our policies look like and that there's statewide child welfare. And we established a precedent that said we will treat every state recognized tribe in the same way ICWA treats federally recognized tribes. And I think to codify that, so it's not me saying it, and it's not the tribal leader at the moment that says this is a guarantee the tribes can have together. We are very willing to come to the table, be part of conversations about how do we advance model state practices, model state policies, and laws at the state level that help support federal guidance and support the next generation. I also think there's a lot to learn from tribal communities as it affects child welfare overall. While children of color across the board are not tribal members, many of the values, principles, and work of tribes and the approaches that tribes take to family support are lessons for the rest of the practice in our world. For public child welfare folks out there, it is learning a new set of policy requirements and understanding the nation-to-nation relationship of tribes and states and federal government. It is really about also saying, what are the best practice values and principles that enhance our work across the board? And then again, how do state agencies work more effectively with tribes and recognize the sovereignty of tribes? One of the things that ICWA 2050 calls out is the challenging relationship that states have had where many of the lawsuits have, Bracken and others, have really generated out of state and local issues, state and local cases where there's a failure to understand the sovereign nature of tribes and a failure to understand what's codified in ICWA that protects the interests of tribes and the interests of tribal children. And how do we begin to make sure that workers understand that each and every day in the public sector so that they do not inadvertently contribute to cases by late identification of kids' enrollment status and late engagement of tribal entities to say, how do you want to advance the permanency for this and safety and permanency well-being for this child? What are the active efforts that you're going to make?
And so that's actually, I think Sarah brought it up historically, tribal child welfare systems mirroring what was around them. Tiara, this is actually a great segue for you. I'd love to bring you into this conversation. We've talked for many years about ways things can be improved in my home state. I'm curious from your vantage point, how is Oklahoma working with tribes and OICWA to improve Indigenous children's outcomes in state child welfare systems where a lot of these kids are?
Well, good morning. Thank you for the invite to be at this table with all of you beautiful matriarchs. I think for Oklahoma, OICWA, Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association, we have been an established association since 1984. Oklahoma tribes are very well versed and have a long history of working together collaboratively with their unified voice in elevating advocacy issues with our intertribal partners and tribal state partners. Here in Oklahoma, we do have Tribal State Work Group. That's a space where all of those tribes have an opportunity to provide education, training, advocacy, work through some challenges that certainly exist here in Oklahoma. For OICWA, OICWA, I think, has been phenomenal in being able to serve as that landing spot for 38 federally recognized tribes to come together. That's pretty impressive. to have the strength and that unified voice. And so back in 2018, ICWA was able to host a strategic planning session, invited all 38 of those tribes. From that strategic planning session, our retained projects or areas of focus and priority was ICWA courts, membership engagement, and training. And you can certainly see in the last 6 years how ICWA and Oklahoma tribes have supported the progress there. Oklahoma now, Tulsa County is the largest ICWA court in the country and is doing some amazing things. And we'll get to talk about that here in a little bit. With our training, the OICWA conference, we continue to grow. And that's one of those spaces where we're able to provide that training to our state partners, anyone who touches the hands of Indian children and families. We try to pull in those that do not have the financial means. We've been able to provide some scholarships in the past. We have just some big heavy hitters in training to be able to bring that here to Oklahoma. And that's not something you see across the country. Membership engagement from 2018, that was an area of change. We have established a website. We have our listserv. We are getting ready to have a whole new membership software. And OICWA's able to be that landing spot for those 38 tribes. It takes some of that workforce and capacity off of one individual tribe to be the one who leads here in Oklahoma. But August of 2024, we had our second round of strategic planning, and it's so impressive. We got through our ICWA partnership grant cycle in 2023, and so we're getting ready to finalize our just final report from our last strategic planning session. But basically, what tribes said that showed up there, and again, OICWA was able to offer that scholarship to tribes that don't have the financial means to do the travel and have Zoom and all the things. We're able to provide that support to those tribes. And so you have a voice, whether you're managing a caseload of 1,200 or 12, tribal sovereignty is absolutely respected and supported in this space of ICWA. In that strategic planning session, we heard a stronger focus on cultural preservation and connection within all of the tribes here in Oklahoma, and supported leadership and advocacy opportunities. And I think that is really one great thing about OICWA is when you bring 38 different Indian child welfare program directors, supervisors, staffs, you do have that mentorship. You do have that peer relationship to be able to have a broader lens, better understanding, conversations that you would not normally have in an isolated area, just specifically within your tribe. And then, it's just strengthening those tribal child welfare systems as well as our relationships with our state partners. There's a broad plethora of issues that we want to tackle with that strategic planning, but I think that those were some of our higher level ones. And then Oklahoma tribes said, you know what, we're showing up and we want to have some established values, some core values. Those are some areas that ICWA was able to help support Oklahoma tribes in the last year and the last 6 years.
I'm really eager to swing back and to talk more about how you're working with ICWA courts in that state. So many really important points to unpack there. I think one thing I want to circle back on is what you're hammering home to our listeners, which is really about the importance of having state child welfare systems that are effectively collaborating with tribes, effectively complying with the spirit of ICWA. So many important points that you bring up. Great segue into another question that I wanted to ask you around the buy-in factor and how that all plays out and how it's going to continue to play out for our children. So, Linda, for non-Native groups or maybe state-based groups who seek to increase ICWA compliance and strengthen tribal sovereignty more broadly, how do you advise that they begin that journey? And how important do you think that it is to have that buy-in from non-tribal or state-based groups?
I think it's really important. I think it comes from a willingness and openness to have dialogue, which means building relationships of trust with tribes, right? And I think that takes more than a minute. Tribes have a long history of not being sure whether they can trust. And therefore, we should not believe in communities that this happens simply by our choice to have it happen. It happens by putting in the time, effort, and energy. I once said to a colleague many years ago, who was doing some work with a tribe and met with a group in a state to be named later and tribes to be left unnamed, but really was met with a response of skepticism, doubt, and said, why are you coming in here thinking that you, because you're caring, are committed, that is sufficient for you to understand? I think responsiveness to that really has to do with a position of humility and understanding that the lessons to be learned to come into compliance with tribes are not simply reading the law and becoming expert at the law, right? It is understanding the culture, the community, and the position that tribes come in, hearing the tribe tell you, right? Hearing members of that tribe tell you who they are, tell you what they stand for, tell you how they wish to work, and honoring that and working through. It doesn't mean everybody agrees every day on everything, but it does mean that there is a tremendous, deeply held value and mutual respect, and that's to be part of the conversation. So first off is how we approach that work. We cannot approach it and say, I got 20 ideas about how to fix Indian child welfare. It really comes from, what do you want to do with your children? What do you as a tribal community want us to do to help you do that with your children, to support that and ensure that we're doing our part as non-tribal entities that are out there? Some more to come, but I think respect is rule number one, and active engagement of tribal communities to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually such an important piece of everything we've been talking about, because as someone who covers this work nationally all around the country, I can speak with some authority that there is tons of really amazing on the ground work being done by tribes to increase tribal child welfare outcomes in their communities and so many amazing things. And that's one piece, one really, really amazing piece of the puzzle that we're dealing with. And the other piece is, how do we have non-tribal entities and state entities really supporting that and elevating that? For a moment, I want to pivot back to Sarah and just kind of stay for another beat on part of the conversation around state child welfare systems and how NICWA is partnering states. So Sarah, give us a little bit of insider knowledge. In what ways is NICWA partnering with states, and which states specifically is NICWA partnering with to fulfill the promise of the Indian Child Welfare Act?
Great question. The first thing I would say is the point of this plan was to create a tool for organizing the field. There is so much good work across the country. In California, the work that California Tribal Families Coalition is doing, Teata's work with the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association, there is great work happening there. And the idea behind this plan was to really lift up those things that are already happening, not to supplant them, not to undermine them by having a larger national plan, but to really have a unifying framework that everybody, that tribal nations themselves, that these wonderful coalitions across the states can locate their work within, to say, we're working on these things. This contributes to this larger set of national goals around this work. So I really appreciate hearing directly from Kimberly and Teata about the work that's happening in California, Oklahoma. This is exactly what we were hoping would happen, was that people would start to claim parts of this plan to say, here's how we can make a contribution. As that happens organically, for us to be able to say, here are the areas we can leverage. Here's some commonality. Here's how we can strengthen our advocacy. This conversation is really exciting. In terms of work with states in particular, there are several things that I would say. As the Brackeen case was going on, we saw a lot of energy around state legislatures considering state ICWA laws. And this is so important because, as Kimberly said, the federal law is the floor, not the ceiling. And what we've frequently seen in states that have their own ICWA laws is that they enhance protections. The protections that they're putting in place are even higher than the federal law. They're expanding protections available to Native kids and families. This body of work around state ICWAs has been important. NICWA has frequently been asked, can you give us the lay of the land? Can you tell us about existing laws, the pros and cons of different approaches to these things? So we've helped lots of states learn about existing law. In several states like Minnesota and North Dakota, we reviewed draft bills. In South Dakota, we testified in a legislative hearing in support of a bill that was being considered there. In Utah, we wrote a letter of support for a bill that was being considered. Historically, we've written curriculum and done training for state workers in some places, like our neighbors in Washington State. We helped draft a training curriculum for workers shortly after the 2016 ICWA regulations were finalized. And so we did training there. In New Mexico and Oklahoma, we've provided training around qualified expert witness provisions of ICWA. These relationships look different across the states, and states see us as a resource and call on us for different purposes. We're happy to be that resource. Our number one advice to states is always to ask about what their relationship with the tribes is, and do they have those relationships in place? So we always want to make sure that as a national organization, we're a supplementary resource, but that we're not the ones that the state thinks they can go to for the substitute for a relationship with the tribal nations they need to have a direct nation-to-nation relationship with.
That relationship piece is so critical to really just engaging with all of the elements of this plan. I think it's a really wonderful question to ask of states and state stakeholders across the country. I appreciate you speaking to that, Sarah. And Siada, I want to ping pong back to you. I know you and I have talked about this as well. And I know one way ICWA wants to engage with this plan is by strengthening ICWA courts specifically. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that goal and the work in Tulsa with your ICWA court.
Sure. I always love sharing about Tulsa County ICWA Court. We have been blessed here with judicial leadership from Judge Kevin Gray. Since he has taken that role, he has embraced that. He is a father of Indigenous children, and I think he's very proud of that. So am I. One of the things here in Tulsa County, just in the last year, it was January 2024, whenever Judge Gray stepped into that role. The last year, he has been able to build and strengthen relationships with the tribes that have those cases there in Tulsa County. And following the ICWA Conference 2022, we began having these conversations about how can we better support families who are reunifying through cultural connection, or just what support can we provide those families. And so the last year, ICWA has partnered with Matriarchs organization as well as My Two Aunties, two other nonprofit. We were able to host listening sessions with parents, biological parents who reunified with their children. And oh my gosh, I've been in this field 23, 24 years, and I just wish we would have had these opportunities, which we learned so much. And so these are one of those aha moments of how we can do this work better. So you see that we'll be able to have those voices of bio parents in state courts represented differently by tribal child welfare. And then, of course, the parent mentor program that is there in Tulsa County. We want to focus on another listening session to learn how we can better support those reunification efforts. We put a lot of work and celebration into foster parents through adoptions. We're not seeing that with our bio parents. This is a big shift. This is a big change. And that helps bridge those families to their tribes, their traditions, their culture. And that is something to be really proud of in a metropolitan area. I cannot brag enough on those tribes in Tulsa County ICWA Court that are showing up to the table and just celebrating their families with blanket, cultural kit, decorating in that courtroom with tribal, just whatever that they want to bring to their families. That is one way through those reunification efforts, cultural inclusions, recognition, celebration, and then through better support through those parent mentors. It's a difficult system to walk through. I mean, even us that are professionals that have training and college degrees, those parents have to have that extra layer of support through healing and then just understanding that system. And so I think that's one of those things that is going to shift really hard for Tulsa County here in this next season.
Just the way that you have spoken about that collaboration, given what you mentioned earlier, the ICWA Court in Tulsa County is the largest in the country. That's incredible to hear about. I'm going to be watching how that work continues to play out in the future. Sarah, I want to turn to you for a moment because there was a line that came out of the press release for the ICWA 2050 plan that I really want to bring up as a journalist. I think it's a really important question to ask you. So the press release about the plan states that achieving ICWA 2050's vision will require, quote, work across and within many sectors from the courtroom to the newsroom. I was wondering if you could talk about what tribal communities and ICWA stakeholders around the country hope to see from the media in regards to how they cover ICWA and related child welfare issues.
I think this fourth goal is such an important part of the plan. The first three goals are about tribal capacity, about tribal state relationships, about tribal federal relationships. And then we really think that the media and the role that it plays in public education is so critical to supplement all of this other policy work. So we can be doing the best policy work possible, but if that's not showing up in accurate representation in the media, then that's a real problem for us. When I think about the role of the media, I think about that accurate representation of tribal nations and of tribal families. I think about reporting that includes the complexity and nuance of the structural issues that tribal families and tribal nations themselves are facing with regard to dealing with some tough challenges. Tribal nations are incredibly under-resourced, not only in comparison to states, the funding is definitely not equitable, but in general are under-resourced, and yet are still creatively designing services to decrease the number of kids who are in out-of-home placement. So really, they're doing work that keep kids safely at home, wrapping families and services and supports that they need, and doing important work that stops the transmission of intergenerational trauma and gives families a chance to heal. So in my mind, those stories are newsworthy. Mainstream America is questioning the child welfare system. They're talking about what is the role of this system and to what extent it does harm to families. As the public is wrestling with this issue of how do we do this differently, I think we have such beautiful examples in so many tribal communities around the country. Like, you don't have to look far to see how to do things differently and produce radically different results. Those are all stories that are worthy of telling, and the media plays a really important role in educating the public about that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I want to just kind of circle back to something Tiara had said earlier. I love that she brought up the My Two Aunties program happening in California. That is a great example of work being done differently and not having to look too far to see how there can be radically different results when you're looking at how tribes are doing things. I was privileged to do a profile feature on the My Two Aunties program, and so I will put that in the show notes for the listeners out there that want to read more about that and the work they were doing and continue to do on behalf of their children and families. Kimberly, I want to turn to you for a moment and talk about the coalition at CTFC, the California Tribal Family Coalition, which is a group with multiple Indigenous stakeholders. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of going along in the same vein of the communication and visibility factor and really having accurate representation in Indian country regarding child welfare. Regarding the idea of ICWA being the quote unquote gold standard, how can that idea from your vantage point continue to be translated into tribal child welfare policy and practice?
I have to just agree so wholeheartedly with Sarah's comments about elevating best practices that are already happening in Indian country within tribes. We don't have to look too far for what it looks like to achieve that gold standard that ICWA talks about. But California Tribal Families Coalition, we have a 3-basket approach because we understand, as Sarah mentioned, as I know they're doing in Oklahoma, that these are complex issues. So we have our first basket is legislation and policy, and that's state legislation. We look at federal legislation. We partner with folks like NICWA to see what's happening. And we also look very locally as well in terms of policy. And then the second basket is training, and that is both training within tribes. How do we support tribes when they're trying to take over some of that role? But then also, how do we work with county and state partners and train them to understand and have them hear the voices of tribes? And then the last basket is the legal basket, which is direct representation, but then also doing that impact litigation work as well. So just understanding the model that we have seen, and I know is a model that in other places, we can't silo these issues. We have to think across multiple disciplines. And that's where that media and the public facing aspect is so incredibly important. We at CTFC, we've got a website, we're on social media, all of those things. But for example, the Brackeen case went to the Supreme Court. And because of tremendous work that so many people did, we had a great outcome on that. And we at CTFC see that as an opportunity. We kind of see that as, hey, we've got the wind at our back. So let's take the messaging of the Indian Child Welfare Act and not talk always about the disproportionality. Let's not always talk about the lack within Indian country, within tribes. And let's talk about, as Sarah mentioned, those systems that are working, the thrivance that is occurring. It's hard to tell those stories. They're nuanced, as Sarah mentioned, they're complex. They're sometimes pretty uncomfortable because they require us to have a conversation of how did we get here? And so thinking about ways that we can proactively get out of the silo and have those conversations. So one of the things we're doing at California Tribal Families Coalition that we did prior to the Brackeen decision at the Supreme Court is I had a tribal leader say to me, why are we always responding? Why aren't we ahead of this? Why are we always on this side of the V in cases, the state v a tribe? Why are we not there first? So we established the California ICWA think tank, and we said, hey, let's the other side, who are often trying to have a narrative that is very destructive about tribal child welfare, about tribal thrivance. Let's switch that narrative. Let's have a think tank and let's be proactive. And then after the success within the Brackeen case, which by the way, it's a success, but it actually moved the needle forward. It protected what tribes had done and what Congress had done back at the passage of ICWA. So we have to say to ourselves, okay, we were able to protect what we had that was established by Congress, but what does it look like to look forward and do more than that? What does it look like to get folks who are not familiar with tribes and that history and tribal child welfare to believe and to care? It's one thing to train folks to tell them how to do a thing, but it's a very different thing to have them want and to really believe deeply that it is core to their mission. It's core to what they need to do on a daily basis. So at CTFC, we use that language that it was the gold standard. We talk about how tribes are leading the way. We also are really aware of the environment we're in. And so we also want to message things like local control. We want to message things like family integrity, because ICWA is a lot about that. One thing that's very beautiful about talking with folks about the Indian Child Welfare Act, and one thing that was mentioned by Teata, which I so appreciate, California Tribal Families Coalition, California has 109 tribes. About half those tribes are part of our coalition, and they all agree on the importance and value of the Indian Child Welfare Act. That's not difficult, but that united voice is so incredibly important. And then talking about that gold standard and what it means, we have challenges ahead of us to take the narrative of the power and the promise of ICWA outside of the silo that we sometimes find ourselves in. And I love the idea of Sarah's broad invitation, come to an ICWA conference and see, if you really want to see the work. And that's not an invitation to folks that are doing the work. So, that's an invitation to people broadly across the country. Come and learn. You may learn something that you may implement within your non-ICWA court, your non-ICWA practice, because tribes are setting and have been setting the gold standard. And lots of folks can learn from it. We got to get the word out. That's the truth.
So many points to unpack there. And I think one is, as you said, Kimberly, talking about how this ICWA 2050 plan really is something that is supposed to span across multiple sectors and multiple disciplines. And one of those many myriad different areas that this is going to fall into is the area of law and legislative policy. Linda, I'm really curious. I know you mentioned that there are a lot of state-based systems in your coalition. In what ways is CWLA collaborating with other non-Native stakeholders to promote the visibility of Native children and families?
So around this, I think we have a number of opportunities. First, we work with the state equipment managers. It's one of the things that we've had a shared collaboration with NICWA on for many, many years and continue to do that. We also work with them collaboratively on Indian child welfare issues around policy. We do a legislative agenda each and every year. And one of the things we do in coordinating and building our legislative agenda is to connect with people in the tribal communities, particularly NICWA, as a voice of Indian child welfare in many ways, so that we are looking at where our policy agendas overlap and can be shared, how we support each other, how we advance issues of tribal communities and tribal children in our advocacy efforts. So that's part of our national work each year, and has been for quite some time and will continue to be. I think there are some additional places where we are growing that partnership. We run an academic journal, well-respected, one of the older child welfare journals called Child Welfare, for many, many years. In the course of doing that, we just selected last summer, as I came on board, we were at a point of change for our senior editor for the journal, and we selected a Native senior editor, quite purposefully, someone who works in the space of children, families, and tribes, and really works on those issues. Priscilla Day is our editor as of last summer. We love Priscilla. She has been in this space for many years. She is a senior, respected individual who knows this work in and out. And, we did that on purpose to make sure that the work of academics who are in this area of scholarly experts is also reflected in our work, that we are featuring the best practice work of those tribes. Our journal is very well read around the country in child welfare. It was important to make sure that we had high quality Indian child welfare content as a part of that work on an ongoing basis.
Obviously, so much more to come, but really looking forward to seeing the things that come out of that journal. And I was just wanting to kind of pose this question to you as we're thinking about this new year, 2025, that we're in. Kimberly, what are some things we as the public can be expecting from CTFC in the new year, looking ahead, and how CTFC is going to be working with NICWA and other partners to build policy-based solutions to improve ICWA and have states fulfill the promise of ICWA more strongly? Certainly, strengthening tribal self-determination is a very important aspect of all this as well. Looking ahead, what should people be looking for and expecting from CTFC when it comes to policy-based solutions?
Thank you for the question, because, it's the beginning of the new year, and it's really exciting to get to think about. I mean, not that we work on a calendar, but it feels like a restart. There has been, as Sarah said, already so many important things done as we wrapped up 2024. So again, the wind is at our back. This is a time to really look forward. So some of the areas that we're focused on, kind of where we started, which is what does it look like to build tribal capacity in a way that is not actually undermining of tribes, like that cyclical funding, like that difficult ability to go after the resources that are offered. Some other areas we think are important, the 2050 report from NICWA, this beautiful broad roadmap. Here in California, one of the areas that we are looking at are what does it look like to achieve some public law 280 reform? That is something that is definitely on our radar. Also, looking at the Way Forward report, which came out of a congressional mandate. There's some excellent ideas within that report, as a resource where folks can say, they can take the 2050 report from NICWA, they can take the Way Forward report, and they can say, hey, what out of this works for us? So we're doing that at CTFC. What are the areas looking beyond just tribal child welfare? Because again, it's a complicated set of circumstances and a complicated history that brings people to this place. So another area we're looking at, we're partnering with the state of California on juvenile justice or juvenile delinquency reform. One area that we would like to see is tribes be brought into cases in which youth are in the juvenile justice system, because we know that the pipeline, unfortunately, often goes from child welfare into the juvenile justice system. When we see tribes in the conversation around their kids in the child welfare system, we know the benefits. So let's bring that over to that other area where, unfortunately, many kids end up. That's another area where we're partnering with the state, and really, it's just been a great partnership. We presented at one of their conferences. It was just really, really great. And so we're looking at that and thinking about the Indian Child Welfare Act and tribal child welfare and going to those concentric circles of the issues that lie just outside, not duplicating the tribal court systems that tribes have found themselves within states, but saying, what does our tribal healing and resilience look like when a family is struggling? Lastly, an area we're looking at is thrivance and visibility. What does it look like to say that the Indian Child Welfare Act isn't a small niche area? Indian law generally isn't a small niche area. It's really a veneer on top of so many things that are involved in just this democracy that we have in the United States. So we have more Native people, especially Native women, on the bench now than we've ever had before. So let's keep working on that. But also make sure it's not just Native judges who bring that knowledge. What does it look like to have everybody in the systems, non-Native folks and Native folks, understand what needs to be occurring and buy into, and truly believe in the promise of the Indian Child Welfare Act, the voice of tribes, benefits everybody. And so for us, looking at the area of law and policy, We are, as an organization, focused. Our mission is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of tribal children and families and exercise of tribal sovereignty, opening the aperture wider than just tribal child welfare, which is a very, very important area, and saying, what are some of the policy and legislative areas just outside that, adjacent to that can lift up that gold standard and the best practice. So that's where we are. We're really excited going in with an expectation that it's going to be a hard couple of years, especially after so much incredible work by so many incredible people in the build-up to the Brackeen decision of the Supreme Court. We feel there's tremendous momentum to do good work. That's where we're excited.
And again, just goes to show really the myriad of important elements that are, like you said, Kimberly, more adjacent to the center of the issue, but are still really important. California Tribal Families Coalition has launched a online portal to talk about these adjacent issues. I'll drop that in the show notes for our listeners. I want to close our conversation about the importance of being holistic in the approach to improving Indigenous child welfare. Tiara, how do you think this ICWA 2050 plan goes above and beyond when it comes to protecting and elevating ICWA inside and outside tribal communities?
One of the things that NICWA does well with the 2050 plan is there was opportunity for tribes across the country to pour into. We all are sovereign nations with different perspectives, different issues, and representation and voices were brought to the table. That is a huge strength to be able to have all of that poured into this report. And then setting that vision for the next 25 years, that is our roadmap. That's our journey map to give us direction on where to go. But honestly, tribal communities do know what is best for their people when they are better supported through the funding, training, workforce capacity, and then overarching honoring and respecting our tribal values, our Indigenous ways of knowing, that just honors who we are as Indigenous people. That is so prevalent within the 2050 report that just moves us away from Western systems that allows for true decolonization that supports our tribal sovereignty. And so I think it's very strength-based. I think it is one of those things that NICWA should be very proud of, and those have a great tool to be able to help us journey along together. 3 things stand out for me. Having voices of lived experience. It is time, and NICWA has set the bar to pull in those that we are working alongside with to be change agents for those that are part of the system. Another big one was data sovereignty. It is time. It is overdue for tribes to have that voice within state systems and have access to data. Those are our kids. There are so many flaws within access to data right now. One of the aha moments for us whenever we hosted our listening session for the Tulsa County biological parents, what was unanimous across the board with those parents was that those tribal child welfare workers were the true change agents of those families receiving their children back, returning children home by providing the funding and the support and having fully staffed tribal capacity with those tribal child welfare programs. You're better able to advocate for families in court. You're better able to represent those children in state child welfare systems. You're better able to be a partner in our state child welfare systems, court and child welfare. And then the other one, improving communication. Understanding, yes, that ICWA is the gold standard, but those professionals that are in the field, whenever you are doing gold standard social work, it's not just changing lives for Indian families. Like, that's changing lives for families across the board. And so it does set the bar really high. And so when we're doing good ICWA work, we're just doing good work in our tribal courts, our state courts. I appreciate being a part of the project, of the listening session. OICWA hosted one of the listening sessions for Oklahoma and Kansas. And so just hats off to NICWA for being a change agent for professionals and families.
One thing I'm hearing from all of you today in this discussion was really the decolonization that needs to happen and continues to happen for tribal child welfare systems and state child welfare systems when they involve Indigenous children and families. And so I think that decolonizing work is a very exciting aspect of what I am privileged to cover. And it's something that is amazing to see and to continue to see into the new year and the many years to come, as this is a 25-year plan. It's going to be really, really exciting. I'm eagerly looking forward to all of the ways that you all are going to continue this work in these different areas, including just the really big piece of the decolonization work that needs to and continues to happen. And there you have it. So many on-the-ground insights into how things can be addressed and improved when it comes to all the things that we've been talking about today. I want to thank the panelists again for their time and expertise spearheading initiatives around the country. And I want to thank our listeners for tagging along in this journey with us. I'm Nancy Marie Spears, and this is the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCampAudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.